Chapter 10. Square Peg, Round Hole. To do your first job with the Special Forces is an iconic moment. It's boys' own stuff and meant that I was finally part of the club. Even if I'd left the following day, I'd done a mission for the SBS. A few months later, I had a massive weekend of partying planned in Bournemouth, just down the road from the base. I was heading to the pub on Friday afternoon when my pager went off. My first thought was, for fuck's sake, this can't be for real. I want to be out getting hammered. I phoned to check if it was a drill and they said no, come in straight away. On my way back to camp, I was thinking, this is bollocks. We're going to be sitting on a fucking ship for another 3 or 4 weeks and then the job might not even happen. But when I walked in, everything was already moving fast. The Chinooks came in, we got our kit and flew straight up to the relevant airbase. As soon as we got there, we were told we would be hitting a ship that night. This was the dream job. No fucking around, no sitting around waiting. It was fast, it was slick, and it was exactly how I wanted every job to be. It even occurred to me that I might still be able to get back in time for a proper drink up. There was a boat full of drugs doing drops all around the coast, with smugglers on board believed to be carrying weapons. This time I was part of a helicopter team, and there was no time for rehearsals. We had to acquaint ourselves with our objective and target, study the plans of the ship, decide which teams would go where and how we would insert, and then go and do it. When the time came for the helicopter team to insert, we fast roped in the pitch black onto the target, which was even more difficult than it sounds. The sea was rough and the landing bridge was tiny, and because the ship was listing violently from side to side, the rope was only on target for a couple of seconds at a time. 1 inch to the left or right, it would have been fatal. But this was our bread and butter. We trained and trained for this type of thing, so it came naturally. That said, the fact that everyone managed to get on target was largely down to the skill of the pilot, one of whom was Prince Andrew. I used to call him our cabbie. Come on, drive, step on it. And he'd say, they're a bunch of blackguards, but a fine bunch of blackguards. As soon as we were on the ship, we made our way to our objective, which was the main hold. When we opened the door and poured in, we were greeted by piles and piles of cannabis, covering every inch of the floor and almost up to the ceiling. The smell almost took my face off. We all looked at each other and in a joyful tone I shouted, "Fuck me!" As our sergeant came flying in, we were all laughing our heads off. When we saw him, we were almost on the floor because he'd put his balaclava on in the dark. It had slit round his head so that his nose was hanging out of one of the eye holes and one of his ears was hanging out of the mouthpiece. Our sergeant started shouting at us, "For fuck's sake, lads, let's deal with the threat first." And we were an absolute mess. Luckily, while we were in stitches, other teams had taken out 3 enemies on the bridge and we secured the remainder of the ship in a matter of minutes. There were 5 or 6 x-rays on board, but no casualties reported. Once again, they didn't even know we were there until they saw the guns in their faces. As soon as supporting elements were brought in and on board, we extracted as quickly as possible. That involved getting into the boats, getting away from the target, Chinooks swooping in, lifting the boats out of the water and carrying us off. The gig was over in a heartbeat. I flew back to my base, had the debrief, sorted my gear out and was ready to go partying late Saturday afternoon. My officer was at the same party and there were people smoking dope. We were looking at each other and smiling as if to say, if you only knew where we'd just been. Getting to play with all those big boys' toys was almost unbelievable, but also a logical conclusion for someone who grew up playing with weapons and vehicles. I'd basically become the action man I owned as a kid, the one in the frogman's outfit. But it's not as if I'd walk into a pub and tell everyone what I'd been up to in the Special Forces. I might tell people I was in the military, but that was it. Because the troubles were still going on in Northern Ireland, and the last thing I wanted to be gobbing off about was the fact I was in the SBS. But I could tell my family and friends. When you hear people saying, I was in the SAS, but I can't tell anyone, even my loved ones, anything about it, that often means they're a charlatan. We call them Walters, as in the fictional fantasist Walter Mitty. Once I went back to Burton and was so proud of being in the SBS. I ended up telling a mate down the pub. This bloke laughed at me and said, "You can't be in the SBS because you're not allowed to tell anyone." From that point on, I was more circumspect about who I told. I'd see other people talking shit, usually to women in pubs, and think, that bloke sounds like a fucking idiot. And that's how I'd be perceived if I started mouthing off about what I did. Because people don't believe you anyway. You just come across like a tit. You might as well go around telling people you're a dolphin trainer or biscuit designer, which I did from time to time. When I went out in pool in Bournemouth, I didn't say a word about what I did for a living. In fact, I avoided mentioning the military altogether. Lots of the time, I'd tell people I was down from Manchester. I loved the club scene and would lose myself in that world for whole weekends. I was bang into house and techno, had my own decks, and would host parties in camp. I didn't like the stigma attached to being in the military. In military towns, the Green Army has a reputation for bad behaviour, getting crazy drunk and bashing up civilians. I didn't want to be associated with that world or stereotyped as that kind of person. While I was always a bit of a loose cannon, I was never one for fighting in pubs. There were others from the military who'd be out doing the same as me, who hated all the institutional bullshit and didn't really feel like they fitted in, but they were few and far between. Most Special Forces soldiers wanted to hang out with the lads they worked with, but spending my spare time talking shop at barbecues because it might increase my chances of promotion was never an option. That world of networking, talking to people you wouldn't normally talk to and don't necessarily like, filled me with dread. I just wanted to do my work, get out of there, do my own thing and have a good time. It's an amazing feeling to know that you're one of the few. You see people walking around acting hard and think, you've got no fucking idea, mate. That gives you a sense of power and responsibility. But being in the SBS was a personal thing for me, all about the pride that I'd managed to get in. A lot of guys in the Special Forces detached themselves from anyone who wasn't. They wanted to spend all their time among the same kind of people, a bit like people when they become famous. But for me, it was just a job. I still had my old mates from the Marines because I didn't think I was suddenly superior to them. I always needed to see the purpose in everything, so I asked a lot of questions, and asking questions didn't always go down well. Asking questions shows an inquisitive mind, which some people see as a threat. The majority of the training was excellent, but there were moments that would cause me to ask why. Scenarios would be built that wouldn't make sense to me, but whenever I raised my doubts, the reply was always, "Shut the fuck up. We're doing it just because." The jobs were special, and I had a lot of laughs with the lads, but there wasn't enough of the good stuff going on. It's not like I'd return from a mission and immediately be sent off to train for the next one. I'd have to wait for my pager to go off again, and that might take months. And when my pager did go off, that didn't mean the job would always go through. I might be sat in a hangar for weeks before being stood down. Unsurprisingly, that led us to taking risks. One weekend, me and another lad were driving up to Manchester, which is a fair few hours from Poole, when we got the call. An incident had gone off at Stansted Airport, and we had to tell the bosses that we were halfway up the M6. Instead of getting a bollocking, we were blue lit all the way to Essex, with a different police unit from each county picking us up on the borders and clearing the route. We were screaming through red lights, bouncing over roundabouts, and laughing all the way. But as soon as we got to Stansted, we were stood down. That was incredibly frustrating, and it happened all the time. All that adrenaline, and suddenly you were being told to return to camp and shine your buttons. I wasn't settled or satisfied, just as I hadn't been in the Royal Marines, which makes me think being a soldier was never really my calling. I didn't want to be there. I felt I should have been somewhere else. This was the dream job. I was part of a gang that people write books and make films about. But the reality is always different to the dream. My partner Laura often says, "I can't imagine you being in the SBS," to which I reply, "I can't either." The Special Forces was always an alien world to me. I was a square peg who had been hammered into a round hole. Being in the Special Forces was almost like a hobby. I was like a tourist, someone who popped in occasionally before popping out again. I never gave that job the respect it deserved. Something is wrong if you're in the Special Forces and all you want to do is go clubbing. I sometimes wish I was in the SBS now because my mindset at the age of 48 suits the job better. Youth is wasted on the young. Recently, Foxy took me through a checklist of what people go through when they're suffering from mental illness. And one of the things he mentioned was never being settled or satisfied in your work. It was only when he told me this that I realized my mind had never been right throughout my time in the military. It didn't matter that I was, on paper, doing an exciting job. I was still unhappy. And I'd never really been happy. I never felt settled in the military. My head was so busy all the time. There was no peace of mind because I was constantly questioning what I was doing and why I was doing it. That's why I used to drink so much, because it would block that noise out, numb everything and cut me adrift. On the face of it, I was a fun drunk. But it wouldn't be one night. I'd drink for days until I had to stop because of work. And then I'd have to go through the torture of cold turkey when the demon comes knocking on your door as soon as your head hits the pillow. And all you can think about is having another drink to numb your thoughts. I didn't see myself as an alcoholic because it wasn't as if I had a bottle of whiskey on my bedside cabinet. But I couldn't imagine a life without drinking. It was a crutch, especially in social situations. In the military, everyone always has a beer in their hand. So drinking helped me to integrate. Before I joined the military, I was quite judgmental about drinking. I remember my mum going to a work Christmas party, getting shit-faced and puking down my auntie's back in the car on the way home. My auntie was wearing a fur coat, so I wasn't very happy. My mum ended up crawling around outside trying to get into the house. I had some mates round, and when she crawled past the French windows, I said, "How disgusting to have a drunk as a mother," and closed the curtains. But when I went in the military, I became the opposite. That's the power of peer pressure, of wanting to feel safe in the pack. For my mum crawling around on the floor and me being disgusted, fast forward to my brother's wedding. I was standing at the bar getting stuck into the drink when one of Justin's Royal Navy officer mates shouted, "Naked bar!" Naked bar is a Royal Marines tradition to rival wearing women's clobber. If someone from the ranks shouts "naked bar," everyone has to take their kit off and carry on drinking as if it was the most normal thing in the world. It started in Norway, where the bars are more secluded, but soon made its way to the UK, where the bars are more crowded. You won't be surprised to hear that Marines are always being banned from pubs for doing it. So, having heard someone shout "naked bar" in this posh accent, I turned round to see a load of officers stripped to the waist. Affronted, I said, "Fucking hell. Do you guys even know what naked bar is? This is naked bar." With that, I stripped all my clothes off, socks, shoes, underpants, the lot, in the middle of the wedding reception while the party was still in full swing, and carried on drinking. The rest of the night was a bit of a blur. The following morning, Helen wasn't very impressed, although I'd fallen out with her even before I got naked. I went downstairs to pay the bill, still a bit jolly and acting a fool, and everyone was avoiding making eye contact with me. I asked my sister's husband why everyone looked so miserable, and he replied, "Matt, don't you fucking remember what happened last night?" "Yeah, naked bar, it's a Marine tradition." "No, not naked bar. The last time I saw you, you had your cock in your aunt's ear." I left the hotel pretty sharpish after that. Thankfully, my aunt saw the funny side. Alcohol can be a positive thing. There was nothing more I wanted to do after finishing work than relax with a drink, and it certainly aided the bonding process. But alcohol can only be a positive thing if you can control your intake, and it quickly got to the point where alcohol was controlling me. It didn't help my overall mood that I was earning under $2,000 a month. When you consider what we're doing, the level of training, the commitment, the risk, and the high esteem we were held in, the pay was pathetic. Some people made it work, but I never could, although that was partly down to my hectic social life, and we were being paid significantly more than regular soldiers. If you ask people down the pub, what do you think a Special Forces soldier earns? They'd be saying things like, 100 grand, $250,000. Nope, nowhere near. And they wonder why they have a problem with retention. We do it for our country and it can be very exciting, but we've still got to pay the mortgage and the bills. I thought they were taking a piss and advantage of our patriotism. I just wanted to be rewarded properly for the job I was doing, without any catches. They give us bonuses, and I worked out that they would roughly equate to a small deposit on a house. So I viewed those deposits as a devious device because they knew once a soldier had a mortgage, they were trapped in the military. Perhaps that's me being over cynical, but I'm convinced there's an element of truth in it. My colleagues weren't aware of my misgivings because I kept them to myself. Complaining wouldn't have gone down too well with many of them, who were die-hard military. Institutions such as the military want you to do as you're told, but that wasn't for me. I hated that. I was surrounded by soldiers who were great around camp, whose boots were always shiny and who would always be on time. But you get them in the field and they perform like a bag of shit. In that respect, it was no different to working in an office, in that someone who turns up on time every day and stays later than everyone else might be terrible at the job, but will still impress the bosses. As a soldier in peacetime, you get noticed more for the stuff you do in camp than in the field. But I couldn't handle the monotone existence of being a camp soldier. That's why I go partying and turn up late the next day, because the partying and the drinking were substitutes for the jobs we weren't doing. When I was partying and going wild on camp, even during the week, some of my troop sergeants would try to rein me in, but they couldn't. Other troop sergeants could see a bit of themselves in me and tolerated my behaviour. People imagine the Special Forces to be this slick, disciplined group of people, but that's not an accurate picture. The SAS and SBS are a bunch of mavericks who can and will get the job done when needed. That goes back to its roots, when they were thrown together in the Second World War. They were guys who would do whatever it took. They weren't about following orders and seeking higher command. I've got the target in sights, can I take the shot? Oh, he seems to have gone now. They got things done and got the fuck out of there. But even within that Special Forces environment, some leaders aren't able to accommodate nonconformists. Nonconformists are too often written off as misfits and therefore impossible to manage. That's how I was viewed in the SBS because I always wanted to be different. Not better, just different. Even when we did psychometric testing, I got different results from everyone else. I was a pain in the arse. I asked too many questions. I wanted to know why instead of just doing things. I thought asking questions was a positive trait, not a negative. I wanted to create my own path, not walk in other people's footprints. The odd job would come up, which I would get very excited about. But afterwards, I'd be back in camp again. There was always the hope that at any given moment, your pager might go off and a few hours later, you might be jumping out of a helicopter. And every time I'd be thinking about leaving, one of those jobs would come up. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to be high octane 100% of the time, not once in a blue moon. So after about a year in the SBS, I put in my notice to leave. I had my notice in to leave for a big chunk of my military career, which tells you everything you need to know about my ambivalence towards the job. Maybe if someone had sat me down and told me I was making a terrible mistake, like the officer who suggested I join in the first place, it might have changed my mind. But no one did, and I probably wouldn't have listened to them anyway. I was adamant that I was leaving and going outside. Then another job came up. My enthusiasm returned and I took my notice out again. That happened 3 times during my 6-year stay in the SBS. And because I always seemed to be on my way out, I was never considered or interested in promotion. Looking back, I realised I wasn't only bored of peacetime soldiering. I feared the apparent predictability of my future. It sounds crazy that I consider a job in the Special Forces too predictable, but I wanted to do more with my life. This was deep thinking for a soldier in his mid-20s, but the reason people get stuck in a rut is because they don't think. And if they do think, often the conclusion they come to is, it's only 30 years until I retire. I might as well settle with what I've got. Stay in as long as I can and get extended service. That would be the easiest thing to do. I could see the journey ahead if I stayed in the military, circling up the ranks, doing the same thing over and over again. I knew people who'd done that. I could see they weren't happy. Why would I want to do the same? It was another break point in my life. I could either carry on pootling along or I could veer off-road and take a more unfathomable but potentially more fulfilling route, the choice was mine. Chapter 11. Over and Out. We spent a lot of time in the SBS training special forces from other countries. On the way to one far-off country, where we were teaching special forces soldiers jungle warfare, my team got pissed at the airport and I missed the flight. I had to be flown into Miami and spent the night there partying while the rest of the boys were building the camp. By the time I arrived in the jungle, the camp was half built and all I had to do was assemble my camp bed. Everyone was looking at me as if to say, "You jammy bastard." One of the things we taught was spy rigging, which is when you drop down the rope from a helicopter to get troops off the ground as quickly as possible. Often, the foreign guys had never been in a helicopter, so when they were lifted through the winch hole, all you could see and hear were their arms and legs squirming all over the place and their terrified screams. There wasn't a lot to do in the jungle at night, so some of the lads would spend their downtime fishing in the river. The river was brown with mud, but they were pulling out these giant piranhas with great big teeth. During the pre-brief for the diving phase, the officer was giving us the instructions and I was looking around thinking, this can't be right. There were giant piranhas in that river. We've seen the fucking things. Surely they'll call it off. Eventually, I couldn't hold back any longer, so I said, "The lads have been pulling out giant piranhas with razor-sharp teeth all week. Last I heard, piranhas eat people. Has anyone considered that?" As was always the case when you questioned their authority, they gave me short shrift. Nevertheless, when it came to the Monday morning, I was certain the diving would be cancelled. But during the brief, an officer said, "We've sourced these packets of shark repellent. When you're swimming along, if you feel something nibbling your legs, remove your breathing apparatus, bite the packet, and shake it in the direction of the nibbles." I couldn't believe it. I thought it was an elaborate wind-up. Alas, no. He was being deadly serious. We had to swim in buddy pairs with a leash between us. When we got out, my partner said, "Why were you swimming like a weirdo with your knees tucked up to your chest?" "Because the first thing those piranhas were going to eat were my dangly legs, so I made yours the first on the menu." Afterwards, the officers came up with this cock and bull story about the piranhas only eating fruit. How exactly the piranhas knew the difference between a nice, juicy tangerine and one of my bollocks was anyone's guess. Some European special forces were training with us one day, doing jungle insertions from helicopters. After we'd fast roped in and were waiting for the command to move off, all we could hear was this horrible moaning and wailing. People were shushing and telling each other to shut the fuck up. But this voice started saying, "I have wood," in a foreign accent. Now people were sniggering. Then someone said, "Quick, medic!" It transpired that this guy had hit a branch on his way to the ground and it had gone in through his arse and out through the groin on the other side before snapping off. I'd wager that was the most painful wood he ever had. At least he got lucky with the exit wound. We also did a lot of river skills, taking small insertion craft with very quiet engines down tributaries and creeks. One night we dropped some lads miles away so that they could carry out a long-range insertion. When they didn't come back in the allotted time, we had to scramble helicopters to find them. People were starting to panic, until about 12 hours later when word came back that they'd been found. The lads had hit major torrents and rapids and were hanging on for dear life to rocks and trees. They'd lost everything, the boats, their weapons, and some very expensive, sensitive gadgetry. It turned out the second in command had done the recce in a helicopter about a mile up, so he hadn't seen the torrents and rapids through the canopy. Luckily, no one died, but it was a monumental fuck-up. As well as training in the jungle, we'd also spent time in colder climes, training in Arctic warfare. And it was always big news in the local media when the British Special Forces were in town, in their big powerboats with guns all over the place. The dive package started the day after we arrived, but I was still up for going on the piss. That's just the way I was. I had to take everything to extremes. Some of the lads needed persuading, But it was Valentine's Day, and I sent them all over the edge by suggesting that their wives and girlfriends would probably be back home shagging other blokes anyway. I managed to scramble a few lads together, and when we walked into this club, the women were all over us. We didn't have to say anything. They were expecting us. I ended up going back to this girl's place, slept through my alarm, and when I woke up, it was 8:20. And the dive package had to start at 8. My immediate thought wasn't, fuck, I need to get there as soon as possible. It was, oh well, I'm in the shit anyway. I might as well enjoy it. So I grabbed the girl, pulled her towards me while singing Rule Britannia, and had a bit more fun. It certainly beat being submerged in a freezing fjord. My snooze was broken by a loud banging on the door. I thought it had to be one of her friends. But when she came back, she told me it was my soldier mates. I was lying there thinking, how the fuck do they know I'm in this girl's apartment? Because I'd gone missing, my bosses had contacted the police, who had visited the club owner. He'd gone through the CCTV and seen which girl I'd left with, so knew exactly where to find me. When I got back to base, I got the mother of all bollockings. But I was always doing shit like that. It was almost like I was trying to get thrown out, but it didn't work. They said they weren't going to tell HQ, and I was allowed to carry on with the dive package. After 3 days diving, we returned to HQ. We were having dinner with the hierarchy sat at the top table, all chatting away, when the local liaison officer walked in with a newspaper under his arm. He made a beeline for the top table and in a very loud voice said, "I see you have been in the newspapers again." The commanding officer replied, "Really? What for?" The liaison officer opened the newspaper very theatrically and started reading as loud as he could. "Last night, one of the British Special Forces commandos went missing. Helicopters were scrambled, but they failed to locate the whereabouts of him. They feared for his life and thought he may have been killed. However, he was later found in bed with a local hairdresser." My head fell on the table. All the talk about the story not getting back to HQ, and it had made the bloody newspaper. Everyone was in hysterics. Even the top brass saw the funny side. I did my job well, so managed to get away with things. But it's fair to say that when I wasn't doing my job, I was a loose cannon. I burnt the candle at both ends. It was all or nothing. My life was a big ball of mayhem. But for a while, I thrived off it. My best mate at the time was a guy called Mick. Me and Mick loved the social aspect of the Special Forces. We're thick as thieves and always getting into mischief. One night back in the jungle, I was sitting around with Mick in camp and I noticed that the banknotes had pictures of gold bullion and diamonds on them. Our minds started racing and we were soon discussing getting hold of some diamonds and working out how to get them home. On our last night, the British Embassy threw a party as a thank you for training the local forces. As luck would have it, we were introduced to a diamond dealer. We told him we wanted to come back and do a deal after we completed Arctic warfare training. So when the 3 months of snow and ice were up, we returned to the UK, got a load of money together and flew back to the jungle. Not long after we arrived, we were walking down this mud road, surrounded by cattle, when we saw a Chinese guy being mugged and macheted. It was like one of those lawless towns you see in the old Wild West films, except more dangerous. Undeterred, we met our contact and bought £20,000 worth of cut diamonds before jumping on a flight to a neighbouring country. We were cock-a-hoop, sitting in our hotel room surrounded by empty beers and telling each other, we're fucking diamond dealers. This is going to change our lives. I'm leaving the SBS as soon as we get home. After a day on the piss, Mick said, we need to mark this moment. Shall we get matching tattoos? Or bracelets? Fuck that. Let's get gold teeth like gangsters. We ended up in the dentist, getting perfectly good teeth filed down. Someone was sent out with some money to buy the gold. The dentist melted it down into caps and popped them in our mouths. For the next few days, we were sat in a bar flashing these golden ashes to everyone. Chuffed as anything. Mine lasted for years and I've still got it in a box somewhere. On the day of the flight home, we split the bag of diamonds between us, stuffed them in condoms and swallowed them. But when we got to the airport, We looked up at the destinations board to see that our flight was delayed for 24 hours. So we had to go back to our rooms, shit them out, polish them off, and go through the same process 24 hours later. When we finally arrived at Gatwick, we made it through customs and Mick went straight to the toilet and shit his diamonds out again. My dad had come to pick us up, and when we got to his car, he said, "I know you've been up to no good, but I don't want to know anything about it." Me and my dad weren't close, but he still knew me too well. I went back to my dad's place in Basingstoke, and Mick went back up to Manchester. Then for the next 24 hours, Mick was on the phone to me every minute, paranoid that I'd already shipped my share of the diamonds out and hadn't told him. And all the time I was thinking, maybe they've disappeared somewhere inside my body. Maybe they'll appear in my bloodstream. Or they're stuck in my bladder and I'll have to piss them out instead. Finally, and to my enormous relief, I needed a shit. Having done the deed, I dropped to my knees over the toilet bowl and began sifting through my own excrement with my hands. But after a couple of minutes, I had to conclude that the diamonds weren't in there. I collapsed on the toilet floor, my gold tooth throbbing and my hands covered in my own shit, and fell asleep thinking, oh, the glamour of being a diamond dealer. Luckily, the next time I went to the toilet, the diamonds dropped out. Through an officer at the camping pool, we ended up taking them to Asprey, one of the most exclusive jewellers in London, to get them valued. They weren't good enough for Asprey to use, but some of the things we saw in that place made the mind boggle. We were taken into a lift and led into this room that contained shopping bags full of banknotes and just about every item you could think of encrusted in diamonds. There were diamond-encrusted guns, diamond-encrusted bikes. There was even a diamond-encrusted dildo. At least that's what I think it was. We ended up selling some of the diamonds to our mates for their girlfriends' engagement rings. The wife of one of my best pals, Tim, was out for lunch with her girlfriends recently when the subject of engagement rings came up. They were going around the table, each giving the story behind their ring. Mine's from Tiffany. Mine's from Harrods. Mine was handed down from Charlie's grandma, until the conversation reached Sarah. Well, she said, the diamond on my engagement ring came out of Tim's mate's arse. Eventually, I moved to a squadron more specialised in more conventional soldiering. Our primary commitment was as mountain troop, specialising in mountain warfare. Our secondary role was as VIP security. One day, we were climbing in the southwest when the team commander's pager went off. In no time at all, we were filling up the vehicles and heading back to Poole. In Poole, we loaded up our kit, got straight on the motorway and headed to the airport. When we got to the airport, we drove straight across the runway in these blacked out wagons before loading our weapons onto this commercial British Airways plane. God knows what the air hostesses were thinking. The plane was bound for Asia, specifically a country that had descended into economic chaos and civil unrest. Our job was to secure and protect all British embassy staff, make evacuation plans and await extraction. But before that, there was a good time to be had. We were ushered into first class, then the air hostesses started popping champagne. That was one hell of a party. Once at our destination, we started working on the evacuation plans, but it never came to that. So we got stood down and sent back home. The anticlimaxes were piling up, and it was beginning to really grind me down. There is a lot of talk about post-traumatic stress disorder in relation to the military, and rightly so. But a lot of stress in the Special Forces isn't caused by traumatic events. It's caused by the toing and froing of emotions. My emotions were all over the place, because we go from sheer boredom to eye-popping excitement in the click of a finger. And on so many occasions, the adrenaline would froth and the blood boil to no end. No wonder I spent so much time in nightclubs. At least I knew I'd get a buzz in there. It was around this time in 1998 that I decided I wanted to fulfill my childhood dream of learning to pilot a submersible insertion craft. So I applied to do a 4-month course in America, working with the Navy SEALs. Shortly after arriving, I bleached my hair white and went and bought a surfboard. Suddenly, I wasn't there to learn how to pilot a submarine. I was there to have a great time in the sun. Recently, a Navy SEAL mate sent me a picture of me on the beach. You never would have suspected I was Special Forces. I looked like a hippie or a beach bum. That was me saying, I am my own man. You can't tell me what to do. I'll do what I want, which was the same as my departure from school. Looking back, I think I actually wanted to piss people off. It was about achieving little victories, getting little jabs in. What did it matter what my hair looked like? I could do the job well, shoot in a straight line and get to target, and that's all I cared about. Fuck all the stupid rules. With the benefit of hindsight, this anger and frustration at being straitjacketed was further proof that I was in the wrong job. I wasn't able to find any flow or purpose because I was living the life of a person I thought I was supposed to be. It's why I was a good, effective soldier, but never a typical soldier, or a contented one. My true self was inside somewhere, but I never discovered who that was until I left the military. I did do some work in America. Best of all, I got to prove that careers office were wrong by learning to pilot that submersible insertion craft, just as I told her I would do. But when I returned to the UK, it all went wrong again. I thought I was going to a squadron in which I would have utilised my new skills. But I didn't get the placement. I couldn't believe it. They'd spent all that money on me to train me in the States, and they were sending me back to my old squadron. So I thought, fuck this, I'm leaving. They couldn't believe it either. But I made my mind up. What was the point in staying if they weren't going to allow me to use my skills? So once again, I put my notice in. I'd done it several times before, but this time I meant it. I was comfortable in the military, but something was missing, and always had been. That time had finally come to veer off-road and take that more unfathomable, but potentially more fulfilling route. I served my year's notice, and although I didn't get any seniority, I was made a team leader, which was unheard of for someone on the way out. But I spent most of my time getting ready to go outside, and most of my last 6 months at home. Before I left, I had to go and see the commanding officer of the SBS. When I walked into his office, the CO was sat behind his desk, and my sergeant major and troop officer were also there. The CO started reading out my testimonial, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was fucking amazing. All the way through my career, I'd been a pain in the arse on camp, and now I was being told what a wonderful soldier I'd been and all the great things I'd achieved. One part of me had always known I was a good soldier, but another part of me was convinced my superiors thought otherwise, because of my refusal to conform. I was looking at my sergeant major and troop officer and thinking, has he got the right bloke? When the CO finished, he said in his classic officer's accent, there seems to be some kind of error here that will need to be corrected. And I replied, what, my fucking name? My sergeant major and troop officer erupted in laughter. My CO had no idea what we were laughing at. Like I say, not everybody got me in the SBS. Chapter 12, Peace in War. That was that. I was ex-military. A former soldier. A civilian. But there were no regrets. I'd been gagging to get out. There was a big black canvas out there that I needed to make my mark on. I just didn't know what that mark was going to look like. I'd done no planning whatsoever. Soldiers leave the military with the attitude, yoo-hoo, it's me. Come and get me. Meanwhile, people are thinking, who the fuck is this bloke? It's not an uncommon phenomenon with any significant career change. But I think it's particularly prevalent in the military. Before long, these soldiers can sink into a depression and start thinking, what the hell have I done? Why does no one want me? Am I worthless? Am I good for nothing if I'm not a soldier? I did know I wanted to carve a new path, be a salesman, learn negotiation and start my own business. I felt that the only way I'd be satisfied was if I was my own boss. But it didn't work out like that. It's common for soldiers to leave the Special Forces and go straight on the circuit, which mainly consists of surveillance work, security for companies operating in war zones, as well as for high-profile VIPs and showbiz people. And a lot of people left the Special Forces about the same time as I did, because they were frustrated at the lack of action. They didn't want to be marking time, were afraid of a predictable future and wanted more out of life. There was more going on and a lot more money to be made outside of the military. I'd never planned to go on the circuit full time, but the jobs paid incredibly well and usually in cash. So I started doing bits and bobs to keep my head above water. I did some personal training, some security work in London, some work for HMRC. It was all word of mouth, not the kind of work you got offered at the job club. Mr. Ollerton, we've got a job stacking shelves at Lidl or a job doing security for Madonna. And before I knew it, I couldn't get off the circuit. I was on the list. I was a hamster in a wheel, conforming to type. Soon, my relationship with Helen started to deteriorate. The first thing she said to me when I walked through the door, having just returned from SBS camp, was, "You're not going anywhere." That was like a red rag to a bull. I felt like turning around and walking straight out. I had thought that leaving the military would strengthen our bond, but it went the other way. I'd been with her since 1991, and this was 9 years later. But during that time, I'd only seen her on weekends here and there. We'd never lived with each other consistently. Every time I came home on leave, we'd have some quality time together, and we knew there would be an end to it. That kept the relationship fresh, and the first few years were great. But when that dynamic changed, things started spiraling out of control. My drinking got worse. Being a civilian allowed me more flexibility, and I spent a lot of my spare time on the booze. I was using it to drown out the monotonous white noise of everyday civilian life. The discipline and routine of the military had gone, and there was no reason not to booze when the chance arose. And the chance arose a lot. Helen was drinking a lot too, and the arguments became more regular and more vicious. Of course, my time in the military was hazardous, but the Special Forces contained me because it was a semi-controlled environment. As I've already outlined, I got into a fair few scrapes while I was serving. But before and after serving were chaotic times, which proves that the military doesn't always manage to reform people. I had no focus or direction. Didn't know what I'd be doing from 1 week to the next. That put pressure on me, and it put pressure on Helen. Some women crave the security of a partner with a solid 9-to-5 job and a regular wage. I can understand that, but I was never going to be that man. In fact, I already knew it was probably best that we shouldn't be together at all. Luke was born in June 2001, and it was a blessing to have such a beautiful little boy. We decided not to find out the sex of the baby, so when he came out, I burst into tears. I had a little companion to do stuff with, whether it be yomping through the countryside or climbing up mountains. I thought I would bring him up to be a little version of me, although I'm not sure that would have been a good thing at the time. For a short while, being a dad was glorious, but it didn't hide the marital problems. We were still arguing all the time. It's just now we were doing it in front of our baby. Luke was like a band-aid for our relationship, but kids should never be used in that way. Getting married and having kids didn't bring us closer together. All it did was make it harder to escape from an obvious dysfunctional relationship. So many couples make the same mistake, thinking that bringing another human into this earth makes more sense than splitting up. The truth is, some people are just not meant to be with each other. 5 months after Luke was born, we got married, and the wedding provided plenty more clues that all was not right with the relationship. When I did my speech, I got to the end and realised I hadn't even mentioned Helen. I spent most of the time trying to make my best man Tim laugh. She didn't say anything, but she clearly wasn't happy. Let's just say it wasn't your classic harmonious wedding day. The honeymoon wasn't a fairy tale either. Even before I married Helen, I felt that the only way I was going to get away from her was through a divorce. I felt I had to carry on down that road until I reached a dead end, and only then would I be able to resolve the situation. So many people end up trapped in similar situations until it reaches the stage when the hassle of staying in ceases to trump the hassle of getting out. We had a house together. Our lives were intertwined on so many different levels, and I don't think I could have coped with the confrontation and disruption. I had nowhere to go, no settled job. I couldn't handle the thought of my life getting worse. I was existing in an uncomfortable comfort zone, just as I'd intended to leave the military on several occasions, but was unable to because the world beyond it seemed so unknowable. I wasn't able to bite the bullet and leave Helen. Throughout that relationship, breakpoints were coming and going without me even noticing them. I did manage to escape the circuit for a while. I had a friend called Carl who was one of these blokes who always had a nice suit and car and a big wad of cash in his hand. He had so much energy, was a great salesman, and was who I wanted to be. One day, Carl got in touch and said in his deep, gravelly northern accent, "Matt, do you want a job?" "Doing what?" "Selling orange juice machines." "How much?" "You can earn $1,000 a week." Compared to what I'd been earning in the SBS, this was mega money. Carl sold franchises to sell these orange Ollie juicing machines, as they were called. You bought a franchise, were given a postcode, got given 10 machines, gave them to restaurants and shared the juice profits 50-50. And for every machine I managed to offload, I got £100. I was given an area in Cornwall, which was perfect. My family was down there, so it would almost be like a working holiday. On my hit list was a cafe on Lusty Glaze Beach, this beautiful, secluded cove near Newquay. There was no access by road, so I had to carry this machine down a load of steep steps. As I descended, I couldn't help having a little chuckle to myself. Here I was with an orange juicing machine on my back, when only a few years earlier, I would have been doing something similar with a pack on my back on the Brecon Beacons. Oh, how times had changed. I walked into the cafe and said to the owner, "Have you got time for a demo?" The owner was a bit busy, but reluctantly said yes. So I plonked the machine on the bar, got some oranges out, and started telling the owner how incredibly easy it was to use. "In fact," I said, "it's so easy, I should ask one of your customers to do the demo." At that precise moment, this surfer dude walked through the door, wearing board shorts and nothing else. So I said to him, "If you demonstrate this orange machine for the boss, I'll give you a free juice." So this dude put the oranges in the top, put the lid back on, and I said to him, "See that button there? Just press that." I had this cocky grin on my face because I thought I had this deal in the bag and another £100 in my back pocket. The dude pressed the button and his face froze into a rather intense glare, while his hair stood on end and started smoking. The fucking machine had electrocuted him. The owner was standing there looking much the same as this poor surf dude, as was I, at least for a couple of seconds, when I snapped out of it, grabbed the machine, chucked it on my back and legged it back up the steps as fast as my legs would carry me. It was the height of summer, about 32 degrees, and I was sweating like a lunatic. When I reported the incident to the head office, they told me they'd been getting calls all week. There were orange machines going wrong all over the country. One person told me they were safe to operate as long as you were wearing shoes, which explained why the surfer dude came a cropper. Other machines were squirting juice all over people's faces and clothes. Machines were being chucked on skips and people had sacks of oranges going mouldy in their garage. I basically walked into an episode of Only Fools and Horses. My mates still tease me about it now. They'll see me and start shouting, "Ollie, Ollie!" But the job selling faulty orange machines did get me onto the sales ladder, and the next thing I knew, I was a regional sales manager, selling cash machines. I'd suspected I might become an RSM one day, except a regimental sergeant major in the military. I took the job to keep Helen happy, although I can't deny that sales had always appealed to me, mainly because I thought I was quite good at it. I was resilient and determined, and all those other things the military had taught me. I employed a load of ex-military mates to fit the machines, and it actually ran quite smoothly. But I was bored shitless. Of course I was. Even being in the SBS bored me at times, because I was now in the civilian world. I thought I had to do what civilian people did, which was dull, uninspiring jobs. I thought there must be something wrong with me. I thought my failing relationship and lack of work satisfaction was all my fault. I'd fallen into the trap of trying to keep other people happy while not considering my own happiness. There is a certain peace in war. There's a simplicity. It's black and white. Someone wants to kill you, and you're going to kill them if necessary. That's why soldiers feel at home in war zones and why so many of them struggle when they come home. When you're in a war zone, you're a small part of a big picture, and the mundane trivialities of civilian life aren't even in the frame. Strange as it might sound, life in a war zone can be so much easier than life outside the military. Soldiers come home and they've got their wives moaning because the neighbour has parked across the drive, or they've bought the wrong kind of cheese, or the washing machine is broken, or the flush has gone on the toilet. They're bickering with their partners about petty things. To a soldier who isn't used to dealing with such trifles, that can be extremely stressful. In fact, it can feel like mayhem, and far less normal than a war zone. When I mentioned the concept of peace and war on SAS Who Dares Wins, I got some incredible feedback. There were so many former soldiers who could relate to what I was saying. These weren't just people who had PTSD. These were people who simply found civilian life so much more challenging than being in a war zone. Even people who have lost limbs crave to go back. A mate of mine got shot in the head by an Iraqi sniper and wanted to return. It's not necessarily the danger that they miss, it's the sense of brotherhood. Being around the lads is something you take for granted because it's such a natural, relaxed environment to be in. And then you leave. Suddenly, you're having to deal with bills and painting fences and tiling bathrooms and an awful lot of white noise. Perhaps it doesn't reflect very well on civilian life, but one of the principal reasons soldiers want to return to war zones is to feel safe again. The rows with Helen became horrendous. She was working at a Porsche dealership as a PA, and when she went on maternity leave, she put all her stuff in a white cardboard box, brought it home and plonked it in the middle of the lounge. I went on a massive bender that night and returned at about 2 the following morning without my key. Helen wouldn't let me in, but I managed to break in through a window. I fell onto a couch in the lounge, and the next thing I knew, Helen was standing over me, screaming and shouting. I thought the world had ended. Then Helen picked up the white box and the bottom fell out, scattering her office things all over the floor. Apparently, I'd used it as a substitute toilet. It's not as if I made a habit of coming in drunk and urinating on Helen's prized possessions, but it was undoubtedly a toxic environment for a baby to be around. Luke was no age, but kids are sponges, and I knew the constant drinking and rowing must have been affecting him. Then one fateful day, my old mate Mick called to tell me he could get me a job in Iraq in a heartbeat. As soon as he said that, my mind opened up to new possibilities. This was early 2003, when Iraq was on the verge of descending into chaos. But I needed to be back in the fold, doing something on a bigger scale. Something with a greater purpose than selling cash machines. The opportunity of being in a war zone and at the sharp end of something big and important was very appealing, and the money was phenomenal. The whole time I'd been in the military, I'd been in financial straits, struggling to make ends meet, and now I was being offered £13,000 a month, tax-free. I even thought that going away again might save our relationship. However, in moments of clarity, I realised that I just wanted to get away from Helen. Society says that you must try to save a marriage, but I didn't want to. The bottom line was, I just wanted to make myself right and feel alive again. I drove down to London, had a meeting with a company rebuilding the infrastructure in Iraq, and they offered me the gig. The following day, Mick put me in touch with another company, and I decided to work for them instead. It was raining jobs on the circuit. When I told Helen, she wasn't happy. She gave me an ultimatum. It's either me and Luke or Iraq. I was deploying to Iraq in 2 days' time, and I had made my choice. In my head, I was already on the streets of Baghdad with a weapon concealed under my jacket. Staying with Helen would have meant more mayhem for me, her, and Luke. I thought that living in a war zone was a far less complicated option. Marriage guidance counsellors are all well and good, but sometimes you can overthink things. We didn't like each other, simple as that. Being in that relationship wasn't doing my mental welfare any good. I'd had enough and I wanted out. So I said, I'm going to Iraq, and that's the end of it. Her giving me that ultimatum was the final nail in the coffin, my justification to leave. And it was the best decision for all three of us. Life might be harder in the short term, but it would get better.